Forget alienation, says University of Calgary professor Barry Cooper. Call a referendum on separation. He says it's time for a new relationship with Ottawa. It's time to reset the agreement in Confederation, one that was established to ensure Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Northwest Territories would never have the power base needed to dictate the direction of their own territory, let alone the country. In this episode on Western Alienation, we invited Professor Barry Cooper to join us for a conversation he says it's time to have. Mr. Cooper, Professor Cooper, welcome, and thank you for joining me on this segment of the show about Western alienation in Alberta in particular and the Prairie Provinces in general. What's your sense of where we're at in terms of the mood?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't call it alienation. I'd call it injustice, and I'd call it a growing awareness of a kind of structural injustice that has been part of what is now the Western Canadian experience from a period from before Confederation. I've written a fair bit about this, and it's something that's not going to go away. So far as I'm concerned, there's no kind of compromise within Confederation that Laurentian Canada would be willing to accept. They've never accepted that Westerners, whether they were Indians, Métis, settlers from the Orkneys, the Hebrides, the old Hudson Bay people, were ever partners. They've even had problems with BC, but nothing compared to what it's been like from what's now the Prairie Provinces.
The Prairie Provinces were a creation of Ottawa to begin with, and from the very beginning, the relationship was set up so that there wouldn't be an appropriate power base in the West to be able to exercise control over first your own domain completely, and then there was this desire to make sure that the West didn't have too much power in Parliament.
Yeah, and before that, the Northwest, the Northeast too, that was given to Quebec after the Hudson Bay Company left, and Rupert's Land, were controlled from London. Mm-hmm. So we have been part of an imperial political, I'd call it bureaucratic domination from long before Confederation. And essentially, Macdonald simply modified the structure that had been in place from London and applied it to the, we weren't provinces, to the territory. Mm-hmm. For until 1930, essentially. None of that has changed. None of it, I don't think, ever will change because it has grown into a kind of what in political science we sometimes call a political myth about the way that Laurentian Canada looks at this part of the country and the experience that we have had from Laurentian policies for, 5 generations now. That's a long time.
Well, if we go back and look at the Milch Cow campaign, with the cow being fed in Alberta and being milked in Ontario, this feeling of injustice has existed for quite some time. It has ebbed and flowed at times, and then it really started to intensify in the 1980s, especially when the National Energy Program was introduced. And I think that when it boiled up, that's when Ottawa actually started to listen. Is there value in Alberta starting to say, we're sick and tired of this treatment?
Yeah, there's a great deal of value in it, not as a threat, but because independence would be much better off as an independent country. And because I used to think there would be, you could reform Confederation, and there's certainly been willingness in the Prairie Provinces. The 2 premiers of Saskatchewan and Alberta are still in that, I would say, diluted state that something can be done. But it didn't start with the National Energy Program. It started with the national policy. It started with the Wheat Board, or it continued with the Wheat Board. It has been the same kind of exploitation that we have tried just about everything, inside the parties, outside the parties, third parties. Strange things like social credit, or the progressives, the NDP, you name it. and nothing's worked. So eventually, I'd say Westerners will come to the conclusion that nothing ever will work. And then there's only one option.
There seems to be a tremendous amount of interest, of course, coming out of the Fair Deal panel, which I find interesting, kind of mirrors the firewall letter that was issued about 20 years ago. Do you think that there's any real value in this exercise?
The interesting thing about the experience that members of the panel had going around the province was the number of times they were told, we want out. Not we want things changed, we want to change the equalization formula. Sure, there are people who wanted that. But the number of people who said, we have simply had enough, we're out of here, absolutely astonished. I mean, I've talked to some of the people, and they were absolutely astonished at the depth and the vehemence particularly of Albertans. I assume if Premier Moe did something similar in Saskatchewan, he would be also surprised.
At the moment, the polls suggest there's about 25%, not just for some kind of independence, but for actually seceding from Canada. From the way that you're talking, it sounds like you believe that the number is on the cusp of rising.
Yeah, I think it could only go up. And it's not because Albertans and the Saskatchewanians are pig-headed about this. It's because Central Canada will not change. And we have no reason to expect that they'll change. Mm-hmm. They have absolutely no interest in doing anything except exploiting us, whether it's wheat or potash or uranium and oil and gas. And that will continue, till the cows come home.
Getting there, getting to separation will not be an easy process. Do you believe that it is possible?
Absolutely. And it's not that difficult. It takes political leadership. And it takes a premier here and next door who understand that the alternatives for reform within Canada no longer exist. And when that happens, and it'll happen, sooner or later, at least if my analysis is right, it will happen sooner or later, then it will happen very quickly because the 25% who are in favor of independence now, with the proper kind of leadership, will be 50%, within 6 months, and it'll be 75% pretty darn quickly.
You believe that it could go that high?
Yeah, I mean, once you figure it out, once you figure that reform is simply not in the cards, because you have to have, it takes two to tango, and these guys, they don't want to change. Mm-hmm. They never have, not since before Confederation, and they sure as heck don't want to change now.
So in trying to understand this for myself, I started to look at the Clarity Act, which is a little ambiguous in the sense that it says there has to be a clear question that is asked, but that question, the clarity of it, has to be determined by Parliament. And so when I talk about this ambiguity, it's as though Parliament said, okay, you can go ahead and form the question, but if we don't like it, we're not going to let you ask it.
And it was drawn up deliberately that way. And it was drawn up at the time by Stéphane Dion and Jean Chrétien because they didn't want to be able to legitimize separatism in Quebec. So it's not a legal question. It's not whether or not they will ever abide by the terms of the Clarity Act. It's entirely political. And this is where it becomes, I've made analogies in a couple of things I've written in the last, year or so, that it's like the English colonies in 1775. That, there's in the Declaration, there's this term, in the long train of abuses. And how much are you willing to put up with? And Westerners have put up with an awful lot. And eventually, then you have to do something. Mm-hmm. And it is, of course, it is treasonous. Of course, it is illegal. And of course, it is going to be very unpleasant. And we're going to have, as the American colonists had, help from abroad. Mm-hmm. They relied on the French. We are going to have to rely on the Americans.
To support you from a constitutional perspective, politically, and economically, or all of the above?
All of the above. The legal issue will never work because the government of Canada will not let it work. For the reasons that they decide what is a not only a clear question, then Parliament has to decide what an overwhelming majority is, or a significant majority in favor of this clear question. If it were 95% on a question like, do you want to leave Canada, they could just as easily say no. They could also disallow the legislation that would make a referendum on a clear question possible. So it's not a legal issue. It's entirely political, and it will depend on whether or not Saskatchewan and Alberta have leaders who are willing to understand the very serious implications, which means, among other things, getting the Americans on board.
Will it also require the cooperation of First Nations, let's say Alberta and Saskatchewan? And if so, can you help me understand how important that relationship will be if you move to separate?
I would say, and I should preface this, but my great-grandmother was Sarsi, or Tsuut'ina, and the way that First Nations have been treated, and Métis, has been no different than the way settlers have been treated. Settlers had treated the First Nations badly all on their own, but the Indian Act is an act that was imposed from Ottawa, and it was imposed on a typical British imperial model on how you rule, Indigenous peoples, wherever they are. The settlers who came here initially with the Hudson Bay Company were treated as if they were Indigenous peoples. So, of course, natives have been treated worse than European settlers and settlers from elsewhere in the world, but not fundamentally different. And it's a political issue. It's not really a cultural issue. Westerners have had more experience getting along with Indigenous people than anybody else, except maybe in the territories up north. There was a whole bunch of intermarriage that it tends to be ignored. I mean, this is what happened in my family. It's happened with some in my colleagues at the university. They come from families that are intermarried. They can identify. I mean, I don't identify obviously with Sarsi, but some of my colleagues do, which is fine. And that's something that, to say it's not understood elsewhere in the country is a huge understatement. So I don't think that's a problem.
You believe that arrangements can be made with the various First Nations, and some have indicated that they believe that they may be able to get a better deal with Alberta and Saskatchewan as independent entities than the relationship that they have with Ottawa, both in the past and going forward.
Yeah, well, there's obviously an opportunity to use this kind of non-imperial model on how you deal with citizens from different ethnic groups. You can think of it that way, or with different histories. And that overthrows the whole subordination of the Old Northwest. And I think it'd be a terrific opportunity.
So what do you see as the steps from here to being able to move towards independence? I asked that because Danny Hozak said, call a date to ask the question. And in doing so, you're going to create some structure around the discussion and bring everything, opposing and supporting arguments, to the fore. Is he right?
He is right that if you put a date to something, it focuses the attention of the participants. They realize they're going to have to make a decision, and they're going to have to think about it. They've thought about it in a very vague way. It should be very focused thinking, and particularly, I proposed a two-step way that if you don't want to change have a referendum on section, 35, the equalization form. If you don't want to do that, then within 2 weeks, a very short period of time, then you have another second referendum on independence. And that'll focus people's attention, not just here and in Saskatchewan, but in Ottawa.
When we take a look at the way that Alberta now has control over the energy sector, former Premier Lougheed managed to secure that, but he didn't secure control over the environment. Does this highlight why it's important that Albertans have or must have complete control over their own legislature and the legal boundaries in which they can operate?
Yeah, that's the argument. The argument against it is that Albertans are environmentally irresponsible, which is just insulting. We have as many, greenies in this province as you guys do in BC. So I think having an understanding that the environment and resource extraction, there are some problems, but most of our resource extraction companies have seen the importance of being clean. I mean, if you go up to Fort Mac, or out in the bush now, it does not look like it did 30 years ago, with those huge windrows of muck. There are these tiny little footprint SAGD. I mean, I'm sure you've heard that expression. This steam injected way of extracting this.
I've been there. Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's completely different. There aren't these huge tailing ponds anymore, where everybody gets their knickers in a twist because 500 ducks die. Well, it's too bad for the ducks, but the number of ducks that probably get killed by windmills is a lot more than the ones that got into that tailing pond.
If we were to move forward with separation, wouldn't it be even harder to move Alberta's products across Canada and beyond?
When Irving Oil thinks that they can ship Alberta crude from Vancouver through the Panama Canal to New Brunswick, that tells you something about the barriers to economic activity in this country. Why there is such, let's say, opposition to the looping or the twinning of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which brought natural gas to the Lower Mainland, right? I can remember when
petroleum as well.
Yeah, I can remember when there were sawdust. There were sawdust trucks running around Vancouver, and that's how and the air was as stinky as it was in London at the same time. So the amount of benefits that have come to BC, particularly the Lower Mainland, because of Alberta petroleum, and of course, BC, when it was discovered, natural gas was discovered up in the Peace River and in the north, is just enormous. So it kind of, you don't like to talk about prejudice very, right away, but there's a certain irrationality in the opposition that we find in BC. I mean, for what it's worth, I think that if Alberta were independent, because BC probably would not join this province, we would have a lot more clout in getting what we want, which is access, say, to Rupert, a pipeline to Prince Rupert. BC's not interested in that? Oh, okay. Well, we're going to have to inspect all of the trains from the CPR that come through. How long? We're not interested, say, in shipping jet fuel to YVR. That gets people's attention. Even when Rachel Notley said, we're not going to buy BC wine, even though a lot of the vineyards in the Okanagan are owned by Albertans, that got their attention.
Yes.
And if you're going to play hardball, then that's what you're going to play.
You talked about Irving Oil and about shipping Alberta oil from Vancouver through the Panama Canal. Well, the Energy East pipeline would have been a much more efficient way to move that oil, but it runs up against the barrier in Quebec. I think that the relationship with Quebec is in particular galling to Albertans because there is this sense that Quebec is willing to take Alberta's money, but it won't take the products that generate the revenue that helps fuel your economy and the economy of Canada.
Premier Kenney had had a conversation, I think it was through the media, with the guy who's the head of the bloc. I can't remember his name now. And, you know,
Boucher, isn't it?
yeah, Boucher. He said basically pick a lane. You know, you can't have your cake and eat it. And Boucher replied, I like my cake, and what I want to do with it, I will do. Well, sorry, pal. That's not the way it works. You can't take $13 billion every year from us and, you know, say we don't want to, we don't have a social license to reverse a pipeline through Quebec. It's not the way it works. So that's fine. They can, you know, if they want, if Quebecers want to get their oil from, you know, Nigeria or Saudi Arabia. That's...
So the big challenge here, of course, is finding the political will within Alberta to push this forward. Do you think that that's possible under the current government, or is there going to need to be a continued and growing popular support before the government will move to that?
Ralph Klein used to say, politicians are always looking over their shoulder to see which way the crowd is going, and so they can get in front of them and say, I'm your leader. I think that when Albertans, when the numbers start showing where popular sentiment is headed, then Premier Kenney or whoever succeeds him will want to be the leader. These guys are politicians. They're not risk-taking statesmen. And I like Jason Kenney personally, and I admire a lot of what he's done. So there's nothing personal about it. But he sees his role differently. And if he does abandon Canada, it will be because there is such overwhelming support for doing so among Albertans.
It will be very interesting to watch this unfold in the near future because the narrative coming out of the East is not supportive of Alberta. And I think that that could do nothing but add momentum to the movement to say, we're not being treated properly. It's time to go.
And that goes back to the first remark I made. I think it is impossible for Laurentian Canadians to understand because they don't treat us as we're a province. We have always been this imperial hinterland. Justin Trudeau's father showed that in spades. The current Prime Minister is destroying the economy here and could care less. Well, Albertans have noticed that. And it's not a Quebec thing, it's not even a Trudeau thing. It's the inability, the lack of imagination, which, is intelligible. Why Laurentians think this way? It's not like they're perverse or something. They have a different understanding of what the country looks like than we do. And they're not going to change. So why should we stay?
That's a good question to end on because I think it's one that people need to think long and hard about. Because from my perspective, I would find it very unfortunate if we were to see Canada change the makeup of provinces, the dynamic of the country, because, well, I care about this country a lot. But I think you're right. That is the question that we all need to consider. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.